Nathan married me to make me Vivian's living bone marrow bank. Over 7 years, I donated bone marrow for him 6 times, and each time he stood guard outside Vivian's hospital room. Before the 7th surgery, I coughed up blood and asked him, "What if I die this time?" Without lifting his head, he signed the consent form. "Vivian can't wait." As the surgical lights turned on, I saw his trembling hands. What a pity, this trembling was for Vivian's 7th rebirth. While my heart stopped on the operating table, he was holding the just awakened Vivian, saying, "It's okay now, she will always be your blood bag." In the operating room, the shadowless lamp hung overhead, its stark white light painfully piercing the eyes. In the icy silence, only the monotonous, regular beep, beep of the ECG monitor stubbornly drilled into the eardrum, like some cruel countdown. Each faint beat tugged at a dull, heavy pain deep in the chest, weighing down the breath. "Evelyn? Evelyn?" The voice came through as if through a thick frosted glass, distant and blurred. I struggled to lift my heavy eyelids, my vision laboriously focusing. A nurse in blue sterile surgical attire was bending over me, her eyes above the mask showing a professional concern, but more so a formulaic calmness. She held a few thin sheets of paper, their edges sharp like blades. "Let's confirm the name again." The nurse's voice cut clearly through the nauseatingly strong smell of disinfectant in the operating room. "Evelyn, right?" My throat was dry as if sandpapered, each swallow bringing a subtle pain. I opened my mouth, managing only a faint whisper, "Yes." The nurse nodded, her gaze quickly scanning the papers. Her fingertip rested on the signature line at the bottom. "Mr. Nathan has already signed," she stated routinely, her tone even and unemotional, as if discussing the weather. "This is the informed consent for the 7th donation. Do you have any questions?" The 7th time. This cold number was like a poisoned nail hammered into my temple, bringing a sharp dizziness. My stomach churned violently, and a familiar, rusty sweetness surged up my throat. I bit hard on the inside of my lower lip, using all my strength to swallow back the burning blood. The nauseating sweetness instantly filled my mouth. Lights and shadows flickered before my eyes, my vision blurred, and time seemed to be pulled back by an invisible force, rapidly rewinding to that suffocating summer 7 years ago. The massive crystal chandelier refracted dazzling light, illuminating the entire banquet hall as if it were daylight. The air was filled with the mingled scents of fine champagne, expensive perfumes, and the cloying sweetness of flowers, making one slightly dizzy. Guests in splendid attire wore proper, formulaic smiles, conversing in low voices, their gazes occasionally casting inquiring or pitying looks towards the bride standing in the center of the hall, me. The pure white wedding dress, custom-made by a top designer, was adorned with tiny Swarovski crystals, so heavy it almost crushed my shoulders. The intricate lace edges rubbed against the skin at the back of my neck, causing a faint, itchy sensation, like countless tiny insects crawling. A hand, with an undeniable strength, lightly rested on my waist. The temperature transmitted through the thin fabric was cold. I instinctively straightened my back, like a marionette forcibly tensed. Without turning around, I knew who it was. The air was instantly filled with Nathan's distinctive scent, a cold mix of cedar and tobacco, the most familiar cage of my 7-year marriage. "Stand properly." His voice sounded right by my ear, low and pleasant, yet without any inflection, like cold water flowing slowly beneath ice. There was no trace of the joy or tenderness a groom should have. That voice carried only a formulaic command, a requirement for placing an object. Magnesium flashes went off wildly, almost burning the retina. Reporters jostled forward, microphones extending like a dense forest. "Mr. Nathan, Miss Evelyn, look this way." Miss Evelyn, as the sole heir of the Sioux Corporation, marrying Nathan of the Shin Group, a powerful alliance, how do you feel at this moment? "Mr. Nathan, I heard you and Miss Evelyn are childhood sweethearts, can you share your thoughts right now?" Countless questions hailed down like dense hailstones. I tried to move my lips, attempting to pull out a happy, appropriate smile befitting a bride. However, the muscles in my cheeks were as stiff as stone, and the smile finally froze into an extremely awkward curve, barely hanging on my face. "I am very..." The word happy stuck in my throat like two hard pebbles, impossible to utter no matter how hard I tried. In that brief moment of hesitation, Nathan beside me naturally took a small step forward, perfectly positioning himself to shield me behind his tall figure. To others, this action might have seemed full of care and protectiveness. Only I knew that this was merely his way of expressing annoyance at having to share the frame with me. He slightly turned his face, the sharp lines of his jaw appearing even colder under the strong light. He didn't even glance at me, his gaze passing over the bustling crowd to some unknown distance. His thin lips parted slightly, his voice not loud but clear enough to cut through the noise, carrying an undeniable, commanding steadiness, a business collaboration, mutually beneficial. That's all. The 4 words, mutually beneficial, were like 4 daggers tempered with ice, stabbing precisely into my heart. The fragile smile I had barely maintained finally shattered completely, falling silently onto the cold marble floor at my feet, breaking into pieces. The guests' knowing whispers and the fleeting looks of understanding and sympathy in the reporter's eyes became sharp thorns embedded in the shards. So, this grand wedding, costing millions and sensationalizing the entire city, was nothing more than a clearly priced transaction in everyone's eyes. And I, Evelyn, was the most expensive commodity, packaged and sold. The ceremony proceeded to the ring exchange. The officiant, with a cadence full of emotion, recited the lines, "Now, please have the groom place the ring symbolizing eternal love on the bride's finger." Nathan turned to face me. His gaze remained calm and unperturbed, like a bottomless cold pool reflecting no emotion. He casually picked up a ring embedded with a large diamond from the velvet tray handed by the officiant. The brilliant light stung my eyes. Just as he was about to slip the cold ring onto my left ring finger, his personal assistant Eric appeared behind him like a ghost, silent and unnoticed. Eric leaned in slightly, his lips almost touching Nathan's ear, and whispered something in a very low, very fast voice. I caught the tail end of that name. Vivian. It was as if an invisible bolt of lightning struck Nathan. His slender fingers holding the ring froze abruptly, the diamond's edges digging harshly into his fingertips. The perfect, distant calm on his face cracked instantly, revealing a clear fissure. A mix of shock, anxiety, and an almost uncharacteristic emotion surged like a dark current, breaking through the ice and flooding his deep eyes. In the next second, he almost without hesitation tossed the ring symbolizing eternity back onto the velvet tray. There was a light ding sound, so crisp it made one's heart tremble. The ring bounced on the deep red velvet, rolling to the edge of the tray, teetering precariously. He didn't even glance at the ring, nor did he look at me again. Those hands, usually steady and strong, now trembled slightly, almost imperceptibly. He turned abruptly, striding towards the side door of the banquet hall, his expensive custom leather shoes clicking urgently and hollowly on the polished floor. The tail of his black tuxedo cut a sharp arc behind him, like a wound tearing through a magnificent curtain. All the guests' gazes and all the flashing cameras instantly focused on his resolute departing figure. The officiant stood there with his mouth open, the prepared blessing stuck in his throat. The entire banquet hall fell into an eerie silence, with only the background music continuing to play its untimely romantic melody. I stood alone under the massive crystal chandelier, in the center of the stage covered with rose petals, wearing a wedding dress as heavy as shackles. My left ring finger was empty, the spot abandoned by the ring still feeling a trace of cold air. The blinding lights were like countless needles pricking my exposed skin. The shocked, pitying, and curious gazes from below wove an invisible net, binding me tightly, unable to move. At that moment, I clearly heard something deep in my heart shatter completely. It was a sound clearer and more despairing than the sound of the discarded diamond ring hitting the floor. "Evelyn? Evelyn!" The nurse's raised voice yanked me abruptly from the icy, piercing quagmire of memories. The stark white light of the operating room's shadowless lamp pierced my eyes again, and the smell of disinfectant was suffocatingly strong. I responded vaguely, the rusty taste in my throat seeming even stronger. The nurse frowned, her eyes showing a hint of concern that was hard to detect, but more so the urgency of the impending surgery. "You look very pale. Are you feeling unwell?" Do you need a moment? Her gaze rested on my pallid face. A moment? I twitched the corners of my mouth into a grimace uglier than crying. What good would that do? In these 7 years, when have I not been pushed onto this cold operating table? Nathan's signature was an unalterable decree. No need. I closed my eyes, my voice hoarse with the fatigue of resignation. Let's begin. The nurse said nothing more, just efficiently started the final preparations. The cold disinfectant swab wiped the inside of my arm, causing a slight shiver. The anesthesiologist approached with the syringe, the needle tip glinting coldly. At that moment, through the observation window of the heavy soundproof door of the operating room, a blurry yet unmistakably familiar tall figure appeared. Nathan. He stood under the stark white lights of the corridor outside, his back to the operating room door. Even through the thick glass and the distance, I could clearly see his tense shoulder line. He had his head slightly lowered, hands in the pockets of his dark gray suit pants, but his shoulders were trembling slightly at an extremely subtle frequency, uncontrollably. Like a cornered, anxious beast. The nurse also saw him and let out a soft sigh, her voice very low, carrying a professional sentiment. Mr. Nathan is waiting outside. Every time Miss Vivian has surgery, he's like this. It's really heart-wrenching to see. Every time Miss Vivian has surgery, he's like this. Heh. A cold chill instantly spread from my heart to my limbs, faster and more thoroughly than any anesthetic. I slowly opened my eyes, my gaze passing through the observation window to rest on his slightly trembling back. 7 years. 6 bone marrow aspirations. Each time, I lay on this cold operating table, feeling the thick, long needle pierce deep into my bones, extracting the fluid that sustained another woman's life. Each time, when I struggled to wake from the anesthesia's chaos, enduring the excruciating pain and dizziness that penetrated to the marrow, and laboriously turned my eyes to look towards the door, what I saw was always his back, standing guard outside Vivian's hospital room. Tall, focused, with an almost devout guarding posture. As if that was the center of his world. While my hospital room always had only the formulaic care of the nurses and the unchanging, gray sky outside the window. What a pity. This time, his body finally betrayed fear, that uncontrollable trembling penetrating the cold glass window. Unfortunately, this trembling was still not for me, whose life hung in the balance on the operating table. It was for Vivian. For her 7th rebirth. For the delicate flower on his heart that never withered, needing my entire blood to nourish it. An indescribable sense of desolation and absurdity gripped me. So, after a person's heart dies, even the sense of pain becomes dull. I couldn't even feel the sharp pain of the anesthesia needle piercing my skin, only a heavy, drowsy coolness rapidly spreading through my veins, filling my entire body. My consciousness, like a kite with a broken string, began to drift away uncontrollably, sinking. Evelyn! Wake up! It's time for your medicine. My body was gently shaken. I struggled to emerge from the chaotic darkness, my heavy eyelids feeling glued shut, taking great effort to barely open a slit. My vision was blurry for a while before gradually clearing. What came into view was Auntie's face, full of wrinkles and worry. She held a cup of warm water and a few white pills, standing by my bedside. Auntie? I struggled to sit up, but as soon as I moved, that familiar stifling feeling in my chest surged forth, accompanied by a heart-wrenching coughing fit. I quickly covered my mouth, my body arching violently. Cough, 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 cough. The strong taste of blood instantly filled my mouth, making my vision darken intermittently. I clenched my teeth, forcing back the sweet, bloody taste that surged up my throat, but the violent coughing still caused a striking dark red to seep through my fingers. Oh my God! Auntie exclaimed, her hand trembling so much she almost spilled the water. She hurriedly set down the cup, fumbling to hand me some tissues, her voice changing pitch. Why are you coughing up blood again? This isn't right. We need to tell the master immediately, we need to go to the hospital for a thorough checkup. This is no joke. Don't. I used all my strength to grab Auntie's wrist, stopping her from turning away. My voice was terribly hoarse, panting from the coughing. "Auntie, don't tell him." I looked up, meeting her anxious and pained gaze, forcing an extremely weak smile. "It's an old problem, it's fine." "The medicine, give it to me." Auntie looked at the blood between my fingers, then at my face trying to appear calm, her cloudy eyes instantly filling with tears. Her lips trembled, but she finally handed me the water and medicine, her voice choked. "You child, why are you so stubborn?" I took the pills and the water cup, the warm water sliding down my burning throat, bringing a brief comfort. The bitterness of the pills spread on my tongue, but it couldn't suppress the deeper bitterness in my heart. "Did the master come back last night?" I lowered my eyes, looking at the slightly rippling water in the cup, asking as if casually. Auntie's expression immediately became somewhat unnatural, her eyes dodging for a moment, stammering, "The master, he was busy with company matters, came back very late, didn't want to disturb your rest, so he slept in the guest room." The guest room? My heart turned cold. This vast villa had dozens of rooms. But Nathan's so-called guest room was always the one at the end of the second-floor corridor, the farthest from the master bedroom. That room had almost become his exclusive space for handling Vivian-related matters. Vivian's medical reports, prescriptions for various special medications, even the aromatherapy she liked, all piled up there. "I see." I responded lightly, handing the empty water cup back to Auntie, and got out of bed. "I understand." My feet stepped on the soft carpet, but my body felt extremely weak, as if walking on clouds. I held on to the edge of the bed, slowly steadying myself, and walked towards the living room connected to the bedroom. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was a meticulously maintained yet lifeless courtyard, the sunlight dazzlingly bright. On the wide sofa in the living room, Nathan's suit jacket from yesterday was casually thrown. The air seemed to still hold a trace of his cold cedar scent. I walked over, my fingers unconsciously brushing over the expensive handmade suit. "Auntie, turn on the TV, please," I said softly as I sat down on the sofa. I needed some sound to fill the suffocating emptiness and silence of this vast space. "Okay." Auntie quickly picked up the remote control and turned on the large LCD screen embedded in the wall. The female anchor's clear and articulate voice from the financial channel flowed out immediately. "Last night, the highly anticipated Heart of the Ocean Blue Diamond charity auction came to a close. Mr. Nathan, the president of the Shin Group, spent $30 million to successfully acquire this rare treasure. According to insiders, Mr. Nathan did this to celebrate the recovery of an important friend." The screen timely cut to a live recording segment. In the auction venue filled with elegantly dressed people, under the brilliant lights, Nathan stood in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his posture straight as a pine. He stood in front of the auction stage, his profile cold and perfect, nodding slightly to the camera, noble and aloof. In his arm, nestled a slender figure in a water-blue floor-length gown. Vivian. She wore exquisite makeup, her face bearing the unique, pitiable paleness of someone who had just recovered from a serious illness. She tilted her head slightly, looking at Nathan's profile, her beautiful eyes filled with undisguised adoration, dependence, and an intense, inseparable affection. In the close-up shot, she even stood on her tiptoes, gently resting her head on Nathan's shoulder. Nathan didn't push her away. He even turned his head slightly, lowering his eyes to look at her. That look was a tenderness I had never received in the 7 years I had been married to him. Though it was fleeting, it burned into my retina like a red-hot iron. Wow. Mr. Nathan is really generous. Miss Vivian is so lucky. Mr. Nathan is truly devoted to her. I heard that Miss Vivian's recovery is all thanks to Mr. Nathan's mysterious wife donating bone marrow time and time again? TSK, that wife is really... The excited chatter of the reporters on TV pierced my eardrums like countless fine needles. My stomach churned violently. I covered my mouth tightly to suppress the intense urge to vomit. My vision darkened intermittently, the image of Nathan and Vivian cuddling on the screen, Vivian's eyes full of love, kept flickering and enlarging before my eyes. At that moment, the phone on the coffee table vibrated sharply, the screen flashing Renha Hospital. Again, Renha. Again, the hematology department. I stared at the name, my fingertips cold. The stifling feeling in my chest surged again, more intense than before. The familiar sweet, bloody taste in my throat could no longer be suppressed. Pfft. A mouthful of warm, heavily rusty liquid spurted out, splattering on the beige expensive carpet, blooming into a striking, viscous dark red. "Madam!" Auntie let out a terrified scream and rushed over. The world spun and collapsed before my eyes. The phone continued to vibrate tirelessly, the words "Renha Hospital" on the screen like a blood-red brand. The deep night was like thick ink, completely engulfing the entire city. The villa was deathly silent, with only a dim yellow wall lamp deep in the corridor, like a weary eye, futilely shining in the boundless darkness. The European wall clock on the wall, its hour and minute hands making a soft click in the silence, coldly pointing to 2 in the morning. Each movement of the hands was like a tap on my taut nerves. Click. Click. The hollow echo spread through the empty living room, making one's heart race. I curled up in a corner of the wide sofa, wrapped only in a thin woolen shawl. That familiar chill, carrying the breath of death, began to spread from deep within my body, seeping out from the crevices of my bones, making my teeth chatter slightly. I held a cup of water that had long gone cold, my fingertips numb from the cold. Finally, the faint sound of a key turning in the lock came from the entrance. As if a switch had been flipped, I jerked my head up, my heart instantly gripped tightly by an invisible hand, almost stopping its beat. The heavy solid wood door was pushed open, and a gust of outdoor cold air, mixed with the faint smell of tobacco and alcohol, surged in along with that tall figure. Nathan was back. He casually tossed the car keys onto the low cabinet at the entrance, making a sharp clang. He didn't even turn on the light, just used the faint neon glow from the distant city outside the window to sluggishly change into slippers. His expensive suit jacket was draped over his arm, his tie loosened, the collar open, revealing his sharp jawline and a small part of his Adam's apple. He looked somewhat tired, with a lingering weariness between his deep brows, and a sense of heavy-hearted oppression. After changing his shoes, he walked straight towards the stairs, his step steady but carrying a purposeful heaviness. His gaze never once turned towards the dark corner of the living room, as if it were just empty air. "Nathan." My voice was extremely dry, like sandpaper rubbing against wood, abruptly breaking the dead silence of the night. His steps up the stairs stopped abruptly. His tall figure froze for a moment in the dim light. After a while, he turned around extremely slowly, his gaze finally landing on the sofa. The living room was unlit, with only the faint neon light from outside outlining his vague silhouette. I couldn't see his expression, only felt that heavy gaze falling on me, carrying the impatience of being disturbed and a hint of cold scrutiny. "Not asleep yet?" His voice was low, hoarse from the late night, devoid of any emotion, as if inquiring about an insignificant piece of furniture. The chill in my chest instantly turned into a burning pain. I took a deep breath, trying to suppress the bloody taste surging in my throat, and, holding onto the sofa armrest, used all my strength to stand up. My body swayed, stars dancing before my eyes, but I forced myself to stand steady. Step by step, I dragged my heavy feet towards him, stopping a few steps away. With the pitiful light from outside, I finally saw his face clearly. He was still handsome, with sharp features. But in his deep eyes, a thick layer of red bloodshot was clearly reflected, like a spider web wrapped around the whites of his eyes. There was undisguised anxiety and worry, as well as a kind of panic that was suppressed to the extreme. For whom, it was self-evident. The hospital called. I tilted my head up, looking into his bloodshot eyes, my voice so calm it felt unfamiliar even to me. "Vivian's condition has worsened again?" Nathan's pupils contracted almost imperceptibly. He pursed his thin lips, his jawline tense like a blade. After a few seconds of silence, he forced out a cold monosyllable from deep in his throat, "Yes." The air seemed to solidify, so heavy it was suffocating. The extremely oppressive aura emanating from him was like an invisible net, tightly entangling me. I could even smell the faint scent of hospital disinfectant lingering on him. So, my nails dug deep into the soft flesh of my palm, using that sharp pain to maintain my last shred of clarity. This time, you need my bone marrow again? This time, Nathan didn't avoid it. He looked straight at me, his bloodshot eyes showing no warmth, no guilt, only a desperate, all-or-nothing resolve as if backed to the edge of a cliff. He clearly uttered one word, firm and unyielding, leaving no room for negotiation: yes. My heart felt as if it were being repeatedly cut by a rusty, blunt knife. Seeing the anxiety and resolve in his eyes for Vivian, an indescribable sorrow surged up my throat. Nathan. My voice began to tremble uncontrollably, with a hint of a breaking sob, yet I suppressed it fiercely. If this surgery, I die? The moment I asked this, I clearly felt my blood freeze instantly. I stared fixedly into his eyes, like a prisoner awaiting final judgment, humbly begging for a trace, even just a trace of human hesitation. Time seemed to stretch. Each second felt like a century. Nathan's tall figure remained motionless in the dim light. The muscles on his face seemed to stiffen for a moment, but deep in those bloodshot eyes, there was no ripple. There was only a bottomless icy coldness, and a touched, cold irritation. He didn't even look at me again, his gaze passing over my head into the empty darkness, as if my existence, my life and death, were just an insignificant, annoying obstacle. Then, with an extremely calm, extremely flat, even somewhat matter-of-fact tone, he pronounced my fate: Vivian can't wait. Vivian can't wait. These words, like bullets fired from the depths of an ice cave, they pierced through my already battered chest with precision and without deviation. No explanation, no comfort, not even the slightest hesitation. Only the bluntest choice. Vivian's time was precious, urgent. And my life, Evelyn's life? It was merely a replaceable part to sustain her precious life. If the part breaks? Just find another one. As long as Vivian can live. Heh. A short, broken cold laugh escaped from my throat. Tears welled up unexpectedly, blurring my vision, but I forced them back. I couldn't cry. In front of him, tears were the most worthless thing, only making him despise me more. I slowly turned around, no longer looking at his cold, emotionless face. My steps were so weak it felt like walking on cotton, each step like treading on knife edges, heading towards the storage room below the stairs. I pushed open the long sealed door, and a musty smell of dust hit me. Groping, I turned on the light, and the dim yellow light illuminated an inconspicuous old low cabinet in the corner. I squatted down, my movements shaky from weakness. I pulled open the heavy bottom drawer. A unique musty smell of paper mixed with dust filled the air. In the drawer, there was nothing else. Only a thick stack of A4 papers, their edges slightly yellowed and curled. I reached out with a trembling hand, my fingertips cold, gently stroking the top sheet. The paper, stored for years, felt dry and brittle to the touch. Clearly printed on it were forms, cold terms, and the bold black words, bone marrow donation in formed consent form. In the bottom right corner of the first sheet were my and Nathan's signatures. The date was 7 years ago, the 3rd month after our wedding. The second sheet, the third, one after another, the dates progressing sequentially. Each signature represented me being pushed onto the operating table, enduring immense pain, contributing the bone marrow that sustained my own health. Each signature represented Nathan, for Vivian, once again choosing to sacrifice me without hesitation. 6 years, 6 times. Each sheet was like a verdict draining a part of my life. My fingers trembled as I counted them one by one. My fingertips brushed over the long-dried ink, over the word Evelyn that changed from initially graceful to later weak and powerless, over the word Nathan that remained consistently cold and fluent in its strokes. I counted to the last one, the 6th. The date was last year's late autumn. My fingertips lingered on the cold paper, unmoving for a long time. Then, slowly, with all my strength, I took out the entire heavy stack of consent forms from the drawer. The papers were heavy, like holding a tomb. Holding this stack of verdicts that condensed 7 years of my blood, tears, and pain, I slowly stood up. My legs were numb and tingling from squatting too long. Step by step, extremely slowly, I walked out of the storage room and back into the suffocating darkness of the living room. Nathan still stood in place, maintaining his earlier posture, like a cold statue. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze emptily staring at the thick night outside the window. My footsteps startled him. He turned his head, and when his gaze fell on the thick stack of documents in my arms, a very subtle fluctuation finally passed through his bottomless eyes. It was a mix of surprise, understanding, and perhaps a hint of embarrassment from having some unspeakable truth exposed, fleeting and almost imperceptible. But it was only for a moment, so quick it was hard to catch. Holding the stack of papers, I walked step by step towards him, stopping a few steps away. Then, under Nathan's cold gaze, I slowly, very slowly, let go. Whoosh! The thick stack of consent forms slipped from my fingers, scattering like withered leaves, fluttering and falling. The white pages spun and fell in the dim light, finally silently covering the cold, smooth marble floor. Like a silent funeral, mourning my life that had been drained bit by these 7 bone marrow aspirations. Each falling paper covered an inch of the cold floor, as if covering an inch of my dying flesh. I lifted my eyes, my gaze passing over the scattered verdicts on the floor, looking straight into Nathan's eyes. They were still a silent sea of ice, reflecting not a trace of my image. 7 years. My voice was hoarse like a broken bellows, each word carrying the bloody air squeezed from deep in my chest, 6 times. Nathan, my bone marrow, my health, have they been drained dry by you, not a drop left? Nathan's gaze lifted from the papers strewn on the floor, returning to my face. His brows furrowed tightly, his thin lips pressed into a sharp line. There was no guilt, no emotion in his eyes, only an impatience at being disturbed and questioned, like looking at an ignorant object. Evelyn, his voice was as cold as ice shards, carrying a warning, now is not the time for this. He no longer looked at me, nor at the glaring papers on the floor. He strode forward, his movements carrying a cruel resolve, his leather shoes mercilessly stepping on those scattered papers filled with my humiliation and pain, making a slight rustling sound. That sound was like stepping on my heart. He walked straight to the small European side table by the stairs, used for letters and keys. On it lay a brown paper envelope, its seal bearing the prominent red cross mark of Rinha Hospital's hematology department. He grabbed the envelope, roughly tearing open the seal, and pulled out a few new A4 papers. The 7th bone marrow donation informed consent form. He didn't even glance at the content, as if what was printed on it wasn't terms concerning my life and death, but just an ordinary receipt. He picked up the expensive Mont Blanc pen from the table, unscrewed the cap, and the cold metal nib flashed a chilling light in the dimness. He bent down, his left hand pressing on the document, his right hand holding the pen, and without hesitation, fluently signed his name in the donor's family signature column. Nathan. The signature was bold and powerful, just like when he signed any billion-dollar business contract, decisive and without a hint of hesitation. After signing, he snapped the pen cap shut with a click and casually tossed the pen back onto the table. Then, he picked up the signed consent form and turned around. He didn't even glance at me on the floor, nor at the scattered documents symbolizing my 6 years of pain. He just carelessly, like discarding a piece of waste paper, threw the new verdict that decided my 7th fate towards me. The light paper spun in the air and finally landed on the mess at my feet. Sign it. His voice came from above, cold, hard, brooking no argument. Tomorrow morning at 9, the surgery. After saying that, he didn't linger, turned around, and with resolute and heavy steps, ascended the stairs to the 2nd floor. His footsteps echoed in the empty, silent villa, like a death knell. I stood rigidly in place, like a plaster statue completely drained of its soul. My gaze dropped dully to the new consent form at my feet. The snow-white paper covered the yellowed ones filled with past pain. The 7th time. The operating room door closed heavily behind me, shutting out the cold world outside. The thud echoed like a blow to my heart, making my already weak steps stumble. A nurse in green sterile surgical attire quickly steadied my arm. Careful. Her voice came through the mask, with a touch of professional concern. How do you feel? Can you hold on? I barely steadied myself, shaking my head, my throat too dry to speak. The chill deep within my body, penetrating to the marrow, began to spread again, more surging and piercing than ever before. My vision darkened intermittently, the edges of my sight starting to blur and waver. The nurse supported me as I walked towards the cold, narrow operating table, its metal gleaming coldly. It was like a huge, silent altar, quietly awaiting its sacrifice. The shadowless lamp's stark white light shone directly from above, illuminating every detail of the table and leaving me nowhere to hide. Each step closer felt like approaching the final execution ground. "Here, slowly, lie down." The nurse's voice was very gentle, carefully helping me lie on the hard, cold surface. The leather's touch came through the thin surgical gown, bone-chillingly cold. I lay down obediently, my body stiff as a board. The anesthesiologist came over with a syringe connected to a transparent tube, the needle tip glinting menacingly under the shadowless lamp. "Don't be nervous, relax. We're starting the anesthesia." The anesthesiologist's voice was gentle, carrying a soothing power. The cold disinfectant swab wiped the inside of my arm, causing a slight shiver. I watched the sharp needle tip approach my vein bit by bit. This time I surprisingly felt no fear. Only a bottomless fatigue and a numbness like relief. My consciousness began to blur and sink, like sinking into thick ink. Just before completely losing consciousness, my gaze instinctively, for the last time, turned to the observation window on the operating room door. That familiar tall figure still stubbornly stood under the stark white lights of the corridor outside. Nathan. He was no longer facing away from the door but slightly turned, facing the operating room. He stood very close, almost pressed against the thick glass. I couldn't see his expression, only his hands clenched into fists, pressed hard against the wall beside him, the knuckles white from the force. His shoulders were shaking violently, uncontrollably. That trembling, through the heavy door, through the cold glass, was transmitted clearly, carrying a near-collapse, hysterical panic. What a pity. The last thread of thought before consciousness completely sank into darkness, carrying endless desolation and irony. This time, he finally couldn't control his trembling. Unfortunately, this trembling was still for Vivian's 7th rebirth. For the delicate flower on his heart that never withered, to bloom again by sucking my bone marrow. And I, the blood bag providing nutrients, whether I lived or died, was never within his consideration. That violent trembling was merely his fear of possibly losing his lifesaver. The cold anesthetic surged through my veins to my limbs, taking away the last bit of sensation, and also taking away all the unwillingness, pain, and that last faint hope that had long been extinguished over these 7 years. Darkness embraced me gently and completely. Chaos. Boundless chaos. Consciousness was like sinking in the cold, viscous seabed, each attempt to struggle to the surface ruthlessly pressed back by invisible immense pressure. The body felt nothing, only a dead silence of nothingness. After an unknown amount of time, as long as a century, a faint light pierced through the heavy darkness. Then came sounds. Distant, blurred, as if through a thick wall filled with water. Blood pressure continues to drop. Tachycardia. Quick. Prepare epinephrine. Push it fast. 1 milligram for push. Evelyn. Evelyn. Can you hear me? Hold on. The sounds grew louder and clearer, with a piercing metallic quality that tore at my eardrums. Those urgent, panicked commands, the sharp, frantic alarms of the instruments, beep 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 beep, the cold, crisp clanging of metal instruments, all chaotically intertwined, forming a massive vortex of sound that violently stirred my remaining consciousness. So noisy, so painful, not the pain of flesh, but an excruciating pain as if my soul was being forcibly torn from its shell. It felt like something was being ruthlessly extracted from deep within my body by an irresistible force. Each extraction took away a part of my most fundamental essence for survival. No. Stop, stop. I desperately wanted to shout, to stop it, but my throat felt filled with scorching gravel, unable to make a sound. Criteria only my consciousness was screaming in despair. the aspiration volume is enough. Quick. Send it over. Vivian is waiting urgently. A strange, cold male voice rang out nearby, overpowering all the noise. Vivian, this name was like a lightning bolt laced with poison, splitting through the fog of my chaotic consciousness. Agony. Overwhelming agony instantly engulfed every cell in my body. 1,000 times stronger than before. Something inside my body snapped completely. The cold puncture needle seemed to turn into a red-hot branding iron, wildly stirring deep within my fragile bones. Ah! From the depths of my soul erupted a silent, utterly scream. At the peak of this soul-tearing pain, some core deep within my body that sustained life let out a clear, overburdened moan. Beep. A long, monotonous, unwavering electronic tone, like the final death knell, suddenly sounded. It cruelly drowned out all the clamor in the operating room. The sharp, piercing alarm of the instruments, beep 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 beep, stopped abruptly. The world fell into dead silence. Only that long, death-proclaiming beep echoed coldly and eternally in the empty operating room. So quiet, so this is how quiet it is when death arrives. Strangely, that heart-wrenching agony, that bone-piercing cold, that despair of being drained bit by bit, all receded like a tide the moment that long tone sounded. My body became so light, light as a feather. My consciousness was clearer than ever, as if freed from the heavy shackles of the body. I could even feel myself floating up. Leaving that cold operating table, suspended beneath the stark, blinding surgical lights. My vision became incredibly wide, with a strange, transcendent clarity. I saw below. On that narrow operating table lay a pale, frail woman. Her eyes were tightly closed, long lashes casting two small shadows on her bloodless cheeks. Her lips were a strange bluish purple. She was covered with a green sterile sheet, only her chest exposed, connected to a mess of wires and tubes. Several medical staff in blue sterile surgical attire were surrounding her, performing rapid and frantic resuscitation compressions. Defibrillator. Charge to 200 joules. Ready. Thump. The body jerked violently under the electric shock, then fell back limply onto the table. Again. Charge to 220 joules. Thump. Each shock only made the body bounce lifelessly, like a broken puppet being manipulated. Is that me? So this is what I look like dead. As I floated, watching the futile resuscitation below with an almost indifferent calm. The heavy, tightly closed soundproof door of the operating room was suddenly pushed open forcefully from outside. The loud noise was particularly jarring in the dead silence of the operating room. A tall figure, like an out-of-control hurricane, carrying the cold light and the smell of disinfectant from the corridor outside, rushed in recklessly. Nathan. His handsome face was now deathly pale, devoid of color, his forehead and temples covered in fine cold sweat, a few strands of black hair messily stuck to his forehead. Those eyes, usually deep and calm, controlling everything, now held only a pure, near-mad fear and desperate urgency. They were filled with horrifying red bloodshot, as if scorched by fire. The moment he rushed in, his gaze didn't even linger for a second on the operating table where the futile resuscitation was taking place. His eyes, like iron filings drawn to a magnet, were fixed, nailed to the other side of the operating room, on the heavy airtight door that had just been pushed open, connecting to the adjacent sterile transplant chamber. The red light on that door had just gone out, and the green light came on. Beep. With a soft sound, the airtight door slowly opened. A mobile hospital bed was carefully pushed out by several nurses. Lying on the bed was Vivian. She wore an oxygen mask, her face as pale as transparent crystal, showing the extreme weakness of someone who had just recovered from a serious illness. But her beautiful eyes were slightly open, long lashes trembling, clearly reflecting the bewilderment of surviving a disaster. And, upon seeing that figure rushing in recklessly, an instant burst of intense, inseparable dependence and love. Nathan. Her voice came through the oxygen mask, weak like a kitten's mewl, yet carrying infinite grievance and attachment. It was this faint call that completely ignited Nathan. Like a beast that had finally found its lost and regained treasure, he rushed to Vivian's bedside in a few steps. His movements were so fast they created a gust of wind, even knocking aside a nurse in his path. He suddenly bent down, extending his arms, and with a gesture that was almost rough yet filled with the ecstasy of regaining what was lost, he tightly, very tightly, hugged the just-operated, still extremely weak Vivian into his arms. His arms held her so tightly, as if he wanted to crush her entire being and embed her into his own flesh and blood. His tall body trembled violently from excitement and the immense emotional impact. "Vivian." His voice was so hoarse it was unrecognizable, carrying the ecstasy and choking sobs of a drowning man grasping at a lifeline, each word squeezed out from his torn chest. "Don't be afraid. It's okay now. Vivian. It's okay." He held her tightly, his chin resting on her soft hair, repeating over and over, his voice trembling severely, "It's okay now, it's okay. You're alive. Vivian. Don't be afraid. I'm here, always." The tenderness, pity, ecstasy of regaining what was lost, and lingering fear in his voice, were things I had never received even a fraction of in the 7 years I had been married to him, no matter how hard I tried. He held her tightly, as if holding the only treasure in the world that had been lost and regained. And just a few steps behind him, on that cold operating table, the futile resuscitation of me was still ongoing. Charge to 260 joules. Last time. Clear. Thump. My body, under that final strong electric shock, jerked once more, then completely, forever, fell into dead silence. On the ECG monitor, the line representing life stretched straight into eternal darkness. The long beep was the only background sound. Time of death, 10:07 a.m. The chief surgeon's tired and heavy voice rang out, carrying the weight of a verdict. This sound did not reach Nathan's ears. He still held Vivian tightly, as if to pour all his strength and life into her. In his world, there was only this woman in his arms who had survived the disaster. Vivian nestled in his broad embrace, her pale face flushed with a sickly blush from excitement and joy. She turned her head slightly, her beautiful big eyes looking over Nathan's violently trembling shoulder. Her gaze landed precisely on the body that had been declared dead and covered with a white sheet. Then, her lips slowly, very clearly, curled up into a tiny arc. It wasn't a grateful smile. It was the smile of a victor, filled with infinite satisfaction and complacency. She even moved her lips slightly, silently mouthing a few words in that direction. Across the floating soul, across the cold death, I clearly read her lip language, "Thanks, blood bag." Her arms, weak and boneless, wrapped around Nathan's neck, holding him tighter. She brought her lips close to his ear and, with a voice that was like a thread, full of post-disaster attachment and grievance, whispered, "Nathan. I was so scared. I thought I'd never see you again." As she spoke, tears welled up just right, wetting his expensive shirt collar. Fortunately, there was her. Nathan's body stiffened suddenly, his arms holding her tightened even more, making Vivian frown slightly. He turned his head, and for the first time, his gaze, carrying an extremely complex mix of disgust and relief, swept towards the operating table. That look was cold, indifferent, like looking at a piece of garbage that had finally completed its mission and could be thoroughly discarded. Then, he lowered his head, and with those thin lips that had once issued countless cold commands to me, he gently, with utmost cherish, kissed away the tears at the corner of Vivian's eye. His voice was low and firm, carrying a promise as if everything had settled, resounding clearly in the silent operating room, and like the final death knell, tolling over my already dead soul, "Don't be afraid, Vivian. It's all over. She will always be your blood bag. Will always be your blood bag." These words, like a red-hot dagger, stabbed fiercely into my already stopped heart, then twisted wildly. So, this was my name. Evelyn. In Nathan's world, the entire meaning of my existence. Always. Vivian's blood bag. On the operating table below, the body belonging to Evelyn, slowly covered by the white sheet, fell into complete dead silence. And the consciousness suspended under the stark surgical lights, upon hearing this final verdict, was completely torn apart by an indescribably immense sorrow and absurdity. There was no anger, no hatred, only an endless, cold, dead wasteland. My vision began to shake and distort violently. The stark halo cycles of the surgical lights spun and spread wildly before my eyes, eventually devouring everything. Consciousness, like fragments thrown into a raging vortex, was completely shredded and annihilated by that cold light. In the last remnants of sensation, there was Nathan's violently trembling back as he held Vivian tightly, Vivian's satisfied and complacent smile, and on the operating table, that blinding white symbolizing the end. And, on the ECG monitor, that eternal, straight, unwavering cold line.